Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, at Shadwell Plantation, a modest but ambitious estate nestled in the Piedmont region of colonial Virginia, beneath the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The landscape of his childhood mattered deeply, not merely as scenery, but as a formative force. Jefferson grew up in a world defined by soil, boundaries, ownership, and hierarchy, and from an early age, he absorbed both the beauty and the contradictions of this environment. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a self-made surveyor and planter, a man who rose through skill rather than pedigree, mapping wilderness for the colonial elite. His mother, Jane Randolph Jefferson, descended from one of Virginia's most powerful families, embedding young Thomas in a web of inherited status. From this union emerged a child who would spend his life navigating the uneasy space between aristocracy and egalitarian ideals. Jefferson's early education revealed a precocious mind drawn irresistibly toward books. He read obsessively, learning Latin and Greek, absorbing classical philosophy, Enlightenment science, and political theory with an intensity that bordered on isolation. While other boys hunted or socialized, Jefferson studied. He believed knowledge was not merely useful, but liberating a tool to escape ignorance, tyranny, and superstition. This conviction would follow him throughout his life, shaping his politics, his architecture, and his private obsessions. At the College of William and Mary, Jefferson encountered the ideas that would define him: John Locke's natural rights, Francis Bacon's empiricism, Isaac Newton's scientific rationalism. These thinkers did not simply influence Jefferson, they gave him a framework through which he would interpret the world. Yet Jefferson was never a philosopher detached from material reality. He studied law under George Wythe, one of the most progressive legal minds in colonial America, learning not only legal doctrine but moral reasoning. Wythe introduced Jefferson to the idea that law could be a vehicle for justice, rather than merely an instrument of power. This education coincided with Jefferson's inheritance of land and enslaved labor, binding him materially to the very system of inequality his ideals increasingly questioned. From the beginning, Jefferson's life was defined by tension between reason and tradition, liberty and property, aspiration and compromise. In his 20s, Jefferson began constructing Monticello, the mountaintop estate that would become both his sanctuary and his most personal architectural statement. Inspired by Palladian principles and classical Roman forms, Monticello was not merely a home, but a manifesto in brick and stone. Symmetry, proportion, light, and rational order defined its design, reflecting Jefferson's belief that beauty and reason were inseparable. He redesigned it obsessively for decades, never fully satisfied, as if the structure itself mirrored his restless, unresolved mind. Monticello stood as a symbol of Enlightenment ideals planted in American soil, even as it was built and sustained by enslaved hands. Jefferson's entry into politics was gradual but decisive. In 1769, he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, where his quiet demeanor masked a radical intellect. Unlike fiery orators, Jefferson preferred the written word. He believed that ideas, once committed to paper, possessed a permanence and authority that speeches could not. This belief would culminate in the moment that defined him and the nation. By the early 1770s, tensions between the American colonies and the British Crown had reached a breaking point. Parliament's taxation policies, imposed without colonial representation, ignited outrage among colonial leaders. Jefferson responded not with violence but with argument. In a summary view of the rights of British America, he articulated a revolutionary premise that the colonies were tied to Britain only by voluntary allegiance to the king, not by parliamentary authority. This was not yet a call for independence, but it was a direct challenge to imperial power. Jefferson grounded his argument in natural law, asserting that rights were inherent, not granted by governments. In 1775, as war erupted, Jefferson was sent to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. There, amid seasoned politicians and military leaders, he appeared almost out of place, tall, reserved, socially awkward. Yet when Congress sought someone to draft a formal declaration justifying independence, Jefferson was chosen. Not because he was the loudest, but because he was the clearest. He wrote with moral precision and philosophical confidence, drawing upon Enlightenment principles to craft a document that reframed rebellion as necessity. The Declaration of Independence was not merely a political announcement, it was a statement of belief. Jefferson's assertion that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights was both radical and dangerously incomplete. He understood the contradiction even as he wrote it. Slavery haunted the document's margins, present in Jefferson's original draft, and then deliberately excised by Congress. The ideals survived, the accountability did not. This omission would follow Jefferson and the nation for centuries. As the Declaration was adopted in July 1776, Jefferson did not celebrate. He retreated. He returned to Virginia, where he was tasked with translating revolutionary ideals into law. As a legislator and later as governor, he worked to dismantle remnants of aristocratic rule, advocating for religious freedom, public education, and legal reform. His Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom represented one of his most sincere achievements, severing the alliance between church and state and affirming liberty of conscience as a fundamental right. Yet Jefferson's governorship during the Revolutionary War exposed his limitations. When British forces invaded Virginia, Jefferson hesitated, delayed, and ultimately fled Richmond, earning criticism that would haunt his reputation. He was not a man of crisis command. His strength lay in design, not defense. This failure deepened his self-doubt and reinforced his preference for intellectual over executive authority. By the end of the Revolution, Thomas Jefferson had become both indispensable and deeply conflicted. He was celebrated as the author of America's ideals, yet privately uncertain whether those ideals could survive human ambition and moral compromise. His life had already proven a central paradox of the American experiment, that the nation's most visionary architect of liberty was also profoundly constrained by the world he sought to reform. The years following the American Revolution did not bring Thomas Jefferson the peace he had imagined. Victory had secured independence, but it had not resolved the deeper question that preoccupied his mind: how a republic grounded in liberty could survive the corrosive forces of power, ambition, and inequality. Jefferson understood that revolutions did not end when wars were won. They merely entered a more dangerous phase, where ideals risked being hollowed out by governance itself. It was within this uneasy moment that Jefferson's role expanded from revolutionary thinker to international statesman. In 1784, Jefferson was sent abroad as a diplomatic representative to Europe, first joining Benjamin Franklin in France, and later serving as minister to the French court. The journey itself was transformative. Europe confronted Jefferson with the full weight of the Old World. He believed America must never replicate. Aristocracy, hereditary privilege, rigid class structures, and entrenched poverty surrounded the glittering halls of Versailles. To Jefferson, these were not symbols of refinement, but warnings, proof of what happened when power calcified and mobility vanished. Yet even as he rejected Europe's political order, he was captivated by its culture. He studied architecture obsessively, collected books, art, and scientific instruments, and refined his tastes. This duality, repulsion toward tyranny alongside fascination with beauty, deepened his already complex worldview. France, in particular, left an indelible mark. Jefferson arrived on the eve of revolution, witnessing firsthand the simmering resentment of a society burdened by inequality. He sympathized with reformers, encouraged constitutional limits on monarchy, and believed France stood at the threshold of enlightened transformation. Unlike many American observers, Jefferson underestimated the violence that would follow. He believed reason and reform could tame centuries of injustice. This optimism revealed both his idealism and his distance from the raw desperation of the masses. Jefferson believed history could be guided. He did not yet grasp how often it erupted beyond control. While abroad, Jefferson's private life became further entangled with contradiction. At Monticello, enslaved people continued to labor in his absence. In Paris, Jefferson formed a deeply intimate relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman owned by him, who had traveled to France as a companion to his daughter. French law technically rendered Hemings free during her stay, a fact Jefferson understood. The relationship exposed the most troubling fault line in his moral universe. He spoke eloquently of liberty, while exercising absolute power over another human being. Jefferson would never publicly acknowledge this relationship, and history would debate it for generations, but its existence underscored a truth Jefferson struggled to confront: ideals proclaimed are not the same as ideals lived. Jefferson returned to the United States in 1789 as the new Constitution came into force. Though he had been absent from the Constitutional Convention, he cautiously supported the document, recognizing its necessity, while fearing its potential for centralized authority. His apprehensions centered on executive power. Jefferson believed that republics died not from weakness, but from concentration of control. When George Washington appointed him as the nation's first Secretary of State, Jefferson accepted reluctantly, aware that proximity to power was both an opportunity and a risk. The Washington administration quickly became a battleground of visions. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, who advocated for a strong federal government, a national bank, and close ties with Britain. On the other stood Jefferson, who envisioned an agrarian republic of independent landowners, decentralized authority, and sympathy toward revolutionary France. These were not merely policy disagreements, they reflected fundamentally different philosophies of human nature and power. Hamilton trusted structure and hierarchy. Jefferson trusted virtue and local autonomy. Jefferson watched with growing alarm as Hamilton's financial system consolidated federal authority. The assumption of state debts, the creation of a national bank, and the encouragement of industrialization all struck Jefferson as betrayals of the Revolution's spirit. He feared that economic dependency would replace political tyranny, binding citizens not to kings but to creditors. These conflicts gave birth to America's first political parties, though Jefferson despised the concept. He believed factions were symptoms of corruption, yet he helped create the Democratic-Republican opposition as a defensive necessity. The rivalry between Jefferson and Hamilton was deeply personal, though often conducted through intermediaries and anonymous writings. Jefferson avoided open confrontation, preferring indirect resistance through political organization and persuasion. Washington, deeply troubled by the division within his cabinet, ultimately sided more often with Hamilton's pragmatism than Jefferson's idealism. This alienation pushed Jefferson further from executive power and closer to the role he found most comfortable: ideological counterweight. In 1797, following Washington's retirement, Jefferson became vice president under John Adams, a man with whom he shared revolutionary history, but little political harmony. The Adams administration coincided with rising tensions with France and the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, laws Jefferson viewed as catastrophic assaults on civil liberties. In response, he secretly authored the Kentucky Resolutions, arguing that states possessed the right to judge the constitutionality of federal laws. Though controversial, this doctrine reflected Jefferson's enduring belief that liberty was safest when power remained close to the people. By the election of 1800, the nation stood deeply divided. Jefferson's victory over Adams was not merely a transfer of office. It was the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political factions in modern history. Jefferson understood the significance immediately. In his inaugural address, he sought reconciliation rather than triumph, declaring, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." It was a moment of restraint, echoing Washington's example, reinforcing the fragile norm that political disagreement need not end in violence. As president, Jefferson faced the challenge he had long feared: how to wield power without betraying principle. His most consequential decision, the Louisiana Purchase, doubled the size of the United States and secured its future as a continental nation. Yet the purchase exceeded Jefferson's constitutional authority, forcing him to act pragmatically rather than ideologically. He justified the decision as necessity, but the moment revealed a sobering truth: even the most principled leaders are shaped by circumstance. Jefferson preserved the republic by bending his own philosophy. His presidency reflected both success and retreat. He reduced federal spending, shrank the military, and sought to minimize executive authority. At the same time, his Embargo Act of 1807, intended to avoid war with Britain and France, devastated American commerce and proved deeply unpopular. Jefferson learned painfully that restraint itself could become a form of coercion when imposed nationally. Power, even when exercised with good intentions, carried unintended consequences. As Jefferson's second term drew to a close, he prepared once again to withdraw from public life. He returned to Monticello burdened by debt, increasingly isolated, and painfully aware that the republic he helped design was evolving beyond his control. The ideals he articulated had taken root, but they no longer belonged solely to him. That, perhaps, was their greatest triumph and his greatest loss. Retirement, for Thomas Jefferson, was never a retreat from thought. When he returned permanently to Monticello after leaving the presidency in 1809, he did so convinced that his greatest work still lay ahead, not in office, but in shaping the intellectual foundations of the nation he had helped create. The republic was secure enough to survive without him at its center, yet fragile enough to require constant cultivation. Jefferson believed that institutions, not individuals, would ultimately determine whether liberty endured. And so, in the quiet hills of Virginia, he began the final and most revealing chapter of his life. Monticello itself stood as a physical manifestation of Jefferson's mind. The house was never truly finished, constantly revised and reimagined, reflecting his belief that improvement was a moral obligation. Drawing inspiration from classical antiquity and Renaissance Europe, Jefferson designed Monticello as a temple to reason, symmetry, and order. Yet beneath its elegance lay contradiction. The same estate that embodied Enlightenment ideals depended on enslaved labor for its survival. Jefferson walked daily through this paradox, rarely acknowledging it publicly, yet unable to escape it privately. Financial strain shadowed his final decades. Despite his stature, Jefferson was perpetually in debt, undone by lavish spending, declining crop yields, and an economy increasingly hostile to plantation agriculture. He believed debt threatened independence, yet he never escaped it himself. The irony was not lost on him. Letters from this period reveal a man acutely aware of his failures, though reluctant to dismantle the system that sustained his lifestyle. Jefferson's belief in gradual reform once again collided with the urgency of injustice. One project, however, rose above personal contradiction: education. Jefferson viewed an informed citizenry as the only true safeguard of Republican government. Kings ruled through ignorance, republics survived through knowledge. This conviction culminated in his most enduring institutional legacy, the University of Virginia. Unlike existing colleges rooted in religious authority, Jefferson envisioned a secular university grounded in science, philosophy, history, and law. The design itself was radical. Instead of a single dominating structure, the campus was arranged as an academical village, symbolizing equality of inquiry and the decentralization of authority. Jefferson personally designed the buildings, selected the curriculum, and recruited faculty from Europe and America. He believed education should liberate the mind, not constrain it. Students were to be exposed to competing ideas, trusted to reason independently, and trained not merely as professionals, but as citizens. When the university opened in 1825, Jefferson was nearly 82 years old. He regarded it as his greatest achievement, surpassing even the presidency. On his tombstone, he requested that his role as founder of the University of Virginia be listed, while his presidency was omitted. Yet even as Jefferson shaped the future, the nation wrestled with unresolved conflicts he had helped postpone. Slavery expanded westward, entrenching divisions that compromise could no longer contain. Jefferson had long feared that the institution would provoke national catastrophe. He described it as a fire bell in the night, signaling existential danger. Still, he had failed to act decisively when he possessed the authority to do so. History would judge this hesitation harshly, and rightly so. Jefferson's correspondence with John Adams during these years offers a rare window into his inner life. Once political rivals, the two men reconciled in old age, exchanging hundreds of letters that reflected on revolution, governance, faith, and mortality. Their letters reveal no triumphalism, only reflection. Both understood that the republic they had forged no longer belonged to them. New generations would reinterpret their ideas, sometimes faithfully, sometimes dangerously. As Jefferson aged, his body weakened but his mind remained restless. He continued reading in multiple languages, tracking global events, and advising younger politicians. He remained convinced that progress required constant vigilance. Liberty, he believed, was never permanently secured. It demanded renewal intellectual, moral, and institutional with every generation. On July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson died at Monticello. Hours later, John Adams would follow him. The coincidence was almost unbearable in its symbolism. Two architects of American independence, gone on the nation's most sacred anniversary. Newspapers across the world marked the moment not simply as the passing of men, but as the end of an era. Jefferson's legacy defies simplicity. He articulated the most powerful language of liberty in modern history, yet lived within systems that denied it. He feared centralized power, yet exercised it when necessity demanded. He believed profoundly in human reason, yet underestimated human suffering. These contradictions do not erase his achievements, but they prevent their sanctification. What Jefferson ultimately left behind was not a blueprint, but a challenge. His ideals were aspirational, deliberately unfinished. He understood that perfection was impossible, but improvement was not. The Declaration of Independence was not a conclusion, it was an invitation, one that subsequent generations would either honor or betray. Thomas Jefferson was not the embodiment of American ideals. He was their architect, designing structures strong enough to endure, yet flexible enough to be rebuilt. The nation that followed would test those designs relentlessly. Some would hold, others would crack. But the language of liberty he forged would remain, waiting to be matched by action. In the decades after Thomas Jefferson's death, his ideas began a second life, one more volatile and unpredictable than the one he had lived himself. Freed from the restraint of their author, his words traveled across time, invoked by generations who bent them toward causes Jefferson could scarcely have imagined. The Declaration of Independence, once a revolutionary manifesto aimed at a distant empire, became a moral weapon wielded within the nation itself. Its assertion that all men are created equal refused to remain safely abstract. It demanded reckoning. During the early 19th century, Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic of independent yeoman farmers still exerted powerful influence. Americans pushed westward, convinced that land ownership guaranteed virtue and freedom. Yet this expansion carried within it the contradiction Jefferson had never resolved. Slavery moved west as well, deepening the nation's moral fracture. Each new territory reignited the question Jefferson had postponed: could a republic founded on liberty survive while denying liberty to millions? Political leaders on both sides of the slavery debate claimed Jefferson as their own. Slaveholders cited his caution, his gradualism, and his belief in order. Abolitionists cited his words, insisting that the Declaration's principles demanded immediate action. Jefferson had become both shield and sword. His silence on emancipation during his lifetime now echoed loudly, forcing Americans to confront the cost of postponement. By the mid-19th century, Jefferson's ideals stood at the center of a national crisis. Abraham Lincoln, facing the dissolution of the Union, turned repeatedly to Jefferson's language. Lincoln argued that the Declaration was not merely a historical document, but a moral compass, an unfinished promise guiding the nation forward. In Lincoln's interpretation, Jefferson had set a standard, not a timetable. Equality was the goal, even if the founders had failed to reach it themselves. This reframing elevated Jefferson's legacy, while simultaneously exposing its limits. The Civil War would test whether ideals alone could bind a nation together. The bloodshed that followed revealed what Jefferson had feared, but never prevented, that unresolved injustice would ultimately demand resolution through force. The Republic survived, but transformed. Slavery was abolished not through gradual reform, but through catastrophic conflict. In the aftermath, Jefferson's reputation entered a long period of near-mythic reverence. Textbooks portrayed him as a philosopher-statesman, the gentle author of liberty, his contradictions softened or omitted. Monticello became a shrine. His words were carved into monuments. The complexity of his life was often sacrificed for clarity of narrative. A young nation, seeking coherence, preferred heroes without shadows. That simplification would not last. In the 20th century, historians began dismantling the mythology. Newly examined letters, plantation records, and the testimony of enslaved families revealed a fuller, more troubling picture. The Hemings family, long erased from public memory, emerged as central to Jefferson's private world. Scholarship forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth: the author of Liberty had lived intimately with unfreedom. This reckoning did not destroy Jefferson's legacy, but it altered its meaning. He was no longer an untouchable icon, but a profoundly human figure, brilliant, flawed, visionary, compromised. His greatness lay not in moral purity, but in intellectual audacity. He dared to articulate principles that exceeded his own actions, creating standards that would later be used to judge him. In this sense, Jefferson's legacy became self-indicting. The ideals he set forth exposed his failures as clearly as they inspired progress. Yet that tension is precisely what has kept his work alive. Perfect men inspire admiration. Imperfect architects inspire debate, struggle, and change. Today, Jefferson occupies an uneasy place in American memory. He is neither venerated without question, nor dismissed without loss. Universities debate his name. Statues are reconsidered. Classrooms wrestle with how to teach his life honestly. These debates are not signs of decay, but of engagement. Jefferson believed that each generation must reassess its inheritance. In arguing over his legacy, Americans are doing exactly that. What endures most powerfully is Jefferson's faith in the human mind. He believed reason could illuminate injustice, that education could restrain power, and that ideas once released could reshape the world. History has proven him both right and wrong. Ideas alone cannot guarantee justice. But without them, justice has no language. Thomas Jefferson did not give America answers. He gave it questions about freedom, equality, power, and responsibility that refuse to fade. The nation continues to argue with him, against him, and because of him. That ongoing dialogue may be his most lasting contribution. He designed ideals meant to outlive him, knowing they would be tested, revised, and sometimes broken. The architecture he left behind was not a finished structure, but a foundation. Whether that foundation supports liberty or contradiction depends, as Jefferson himself insisted, on the choices of those who inherit it. As the 21st century unfolds, Thomas Jefferson's presence in American life has not diminished. Instead, it has become more contested, more layered, and more consequential. Unlike figures whose relevance fades with time, Jefferson remains embedded in the nation's arguments about itself. His words are still quoted in courtrooms, classrooms, political speeches, and protest movements. Yet each invocation now carries weight not only of inspiration, but of reckoning. Modern America confronts Jefferson at a moment when the distance between ideals and reality is once again impossible to ignore. Debates over racial justice, democratic participation, and the limits of executive power echo questions Jefferson himself once posed, then left unresolved. In these debates, Jefferson functions less as a guide and more as a mirror. What Americans see in him often reflects what they are struggling to understand about themselves. One of the most significant shifts in Jefferson's modern legacy has been the centering of enslaved voices within his story. At Monticello, historical interpretation has expanded beyond architecture and philosophy to include the lived experiences of those Jefferson enslaved. The plantation is no longer presented as a tranquil estate of Enlightenment ideals, but as a working system sustained by coercion, surveillance, and inherited bondage. This transformation in public history marks a profound change in how national memory operates. Jefferson's genius is no longer separated from its human cost. This recontextualization has reshaped how his achievements are understood. The Declaration of Independence remains a foundational text, but it is now read alongside plantation ledgers, letters about runaways, and records of forced labor. The coexistence of these documents reveals the full scope of Jefferson's life, one man operating simultaneously as philosopher and master, visionary and beneficiary of injustice. The tension between these roles no longer feels peripheral. It is central. Yet even as criticism deepens, Jefferson's intellectual influence persists. His insistence on religious freedom laid groundwork that protects minority faiths today. His commitment to freedom of expression underpins modern debates about speech and dissent. His belief in the decentralization of power continues to inform arguments against authoritarianism. These contributions have not been erased by moral failure. They have been complicated by it. This complexity forces a more mature form of historical engagement. Jefferson can no longer be reduced to a statue or a slogan. He must be approached as a case study in how ideals are born within flawed systems and how those ideals can outgrow their creators. In this sense, Jefferson's life demonstrates both the danger and the necessity of ideas. They can be compromised at birth, yet still contain the potential for transformation. Internationally, Jefferson's legacy has also evolved. His language of natural rights continues to appear in global human rights discourse, even as critics note the hypocrisy of its origins. Revolutionary movements around the world have long borrowed his rhetoric, sometimes without confronting the contradictions behind it. Today, scholars increasingly examine Jefferson not as a universal hero, but as a product of a specific historical moment whose ideas escape that moment's limitations. What makes Jefferson enduring is not consistency, but friction. His thought generates tension between liberty and control, progress and preservation, idealism and fear. That friction has never been resolved, because it reflects a deeper truth about political life itself. Democracies are not sustained by certainty, but by argument. Jefferson understood this, even if he could not control where the arguments would lead. In his later years, Jefferson once wrote that laws and institutions must advance with the progress of the human mind. That belief now applies to his own memory. Each generation reshapes Jefferson, not to distort history but to bring it closer to honesty. To study him today is not to seek comfort, but clarity. Thomas Jefferson was not the architect of a finished nation. He was the architect of a framework, one that invites constant renovation. Its blueprints include both soaring aspirations and structural flaws. Whether the structure collapses or endures depends on whether those who inherit it are willing to confront its weaknesses rather than conceal them. In the end, Jefferson's greatest legacy may be neither the presidency nor the Declaration, but the expectation that citizens must think critically about power, including the power of those they admire. He offered America an idealized version of itself, then lived a life that exposed how far reality could fall short. The story of Thomas Jefferson is therefore not a closed chapter. It is an ongoing argument, one that continues wherever people insist that liberty must be examined, not merely celebrated. The final reckoning with Thomas Jefferson does not arrive as a verdict, but as an enduring responsibility. History does not ask whether he was good or bad in the simplified language of myth. It asks whether his life, his ideas, and his contradictions can be understood honestly, and whether that understanding can be used to build something more just than what he himself achieved. Jefferson's death in 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, has often been treated as poetic symmetry. Yet even that coincidence carries ambiguity. He died believing the Republic would endure, but he did not live to see the nation pushed to the edge of collapse by the very contradictions he helped embed within it. Slavery, which he once called a moral depravity, remained untouched by his political courage. The question of who belonged to the American promise remained unresolved. What followed Jefferson was not fulfillment, but fracture. The century after his death exposed how fragile ideals become when they are not matched by action. Civil War, Reconstruction, segregation, and long struggles for civil rights all unfolded within the ideological framework Jefferson helped design. His words were used both to defend freedom and to delay it. This duality does not dilute his influence, it amplifies it. Jefferson's true legacy lives not in monuments, but in tension. He forces modern societies to confront an uncomfortable truth that progress often begins in imperfect hands. The ideas that change the world are not always carried by those willing or able to live up to them. This does not absolve Jefferson, but it explains why his presence remains unavoidable. In classrooms, Jefferson is no longer taught as an untouchable founder. He is examined as a human being shaped by privilege, fear, brilliance, and contradiction. This shift represents growth rather than erasure. Mature nations do not protect their founders from scrutiny, they allow them to be questioned, reinterpreted, and understood in fuller dimensions. At Monticello, the quiet rooms and carefully proportioned halls now speak with multiple voices. The architecture still reflects Enlightenment order and balance, but the stories told within those walls acknowledge labor, coercion, and silence. The mountain no longer stands as a shrine alone. It stands as evidence of ambition, achievement, and moral failure intertwined. Yet Jefferson's ideas persist because they invite participation. He did not design a rigid system, but a flexible one capable of being expanded by those once excluded from it. Women, formerly enslaved people, immigrants, and dissenters have all claimed Jefferson's language to argue for rights he never extended to them. In doing so, they transformed his ideals beyond his intentions. This is the paradox of Jefferson's contribution. He failed to embody the equality he proclaimed, but he articulated it clearly enough that others could demand it. His greatest act was not completion, but articulation. He named a standard that would eventually be used against the limitations of his own life. To engage with Jefferson today is to accept discomfort as a form of learning. It requires holding admiration and criticism at the same time, without allowing either to erase the other. It requires resisting nostalgia and embracing complexity. Jefferson does not offer moral reassurance. He offers intellectual challenge. In the end, Thomas Jefferson stands as a reminder that nations are not born whole. They are argued into existence, revised through conflict, and reshaped by those brave enough to confront inherited contradictions. Jefferson helped begin that argument. He did not resolve it. The American experiment continues, not because Jefferson was right about everything, but because he insisted that ideas matter, and that they must be examined by every generation anew. His legacy is unfinished by design. Thomas Jefferson's life leaves us not with comfort, but with responsibility. To study him honestly is to recognize that history is not a collection of perfect heroes, but a record of human beings who shaped the world while remaining deeply flawed within it. Jefferson's brilliance and his failures are inseparable, and that uncomfortable truth is precisely why his story still matters today. He gave the world a language of freedom powerful enough to outlive him. Yet he never fully freed himself or his nation from the systems he knew were wrong. This contradiction is not a footnote. It is the core of his legacy. Jefferson reminds us that ideas alone do not change history. Courage, sacrifice, and moral consistency are required to carry those ideas into reality. When those elements are missing, the consequences echo for generations. The lesson Jefferson leaves behind is not about perfection, but accountability. Every generation inherits principles created by others, but it also inherits the duty to question, expand, and correct them. Jefferson believed the Constitution should belong to the living, not the dead. In that belief lies his most enduring contribution. He understood that democracy is not a finished structure, it is a continuous negotiation between ideals and actions. His story challenges us to ask difficult questions of ourselves. Where do we benefit from systems we know are unjust? Where do we speak of values without fully living them? And most importantly, what will future generations say about the contradictions we choose to tolerate today? Thomas Jefferson does not ask for blind admiration. He asks to be examined. He forces us to confront the truth that progress is often built by incomplete people, and that moral clarity rarely arrives all at once. Understanding Jefferson means understanding that history moves forward not through purity, but through struggle and through the willingness to face uncomfortable realities rather than hide from them. As this documentary comes to a close, the story does not truly end here. It continues in every debate about freedom, equality, power, and responsibility. It continues every time words written centuries ago are used to demand justice in the present. And it continues with you, the viewer, who chooses whether history remains distant or becomes something alive and instructive. If this film helped you see Thomas Jefferson not as a statue, but as a complex human being shaped by his time and limited by his choices, then its purpose has been fulfilled. History is at its most powerful when it challenges us, not when it reassures us. If you value deep, carefully researched historical storytelling stories that confront the truth without simplification, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows these long-form documentaries to exist, to remain independent, and to continue exploring the untold and uncomfortable chapters of our past. We also invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. How should we remember figures like Jefferson? Can great ideas be separated from flawed lives? Your perspective is part of the ongoing conversation that history demands. Thank you for watching, for questioning, and for refusing easy answers. The past is never truly over unless we stop listening to it.